The driver, meanwhile, seemed relaxed and smoked a cigar. I wondered whether he could take that sort of thing better than I. A thought struck me. The majority of these victims of high international politics came from the lower strata of our society. Labourers, craftsmen, storekeepers, students, and those too young to be classified yet. Win or lose, would their lives really change? Would their struggle for a meagre living be easier or worse? In my opinion, if they survived, they would come back to the same hard life they lived before. Not many Germans would gain anything from a victory as far as their personal lives and happiness were concerned. Neither could I feel that a defeat would cause misery all around. People still would go on living and working. The roar of the battle in front of us became more distinct. Finally, we came to a crossroads, and I was astonished to see a colonel of the General Staff, recognizable by the broad red stripes on his pants, coolly trying to regulate the traffic jam. Only combat troops and material badly needed could proceed. Everything else had to wait on the side roads. Engineers stood by to help pull stalled wagons into an open field. There was no time for hesitation. A few miles further on, the battle had reached a critical stage, and this colonel had to decide quickly what was to go through. Looking around, I saw dead horses still in harness, and was told the situation in the early morning hours had been very desperate, hence the presence of this officer who belonged to the brain elite of the army. When the attack started, British heavy artillery kept this main road under fire, causing severe casualties among the troops moving forward. At times it was impossible for them to reach their forward positions at the right time. When our car arrived on the scene, enemy artillery fire on the road had slackened considerably. The enemy was retreating slowly, and during a backward movement it was virtually impossible for their artillery to maintain the same volume of fire as when standing still. Most of the British artillery was horse-drawn, and it took time for them to find a suitable new position, get the range and open up again. This quite apart from the fact that our artillery managed to keep up an enormous bombardment. The screeching of heavy shells over our heads never stopped. The weather remained good and early that afternoon. I finally found K-Flak 82 on the main highway near Bonny St. Emile. The loss of the lieutenant and sergeant in the morning had shaken up the crew, and they were a quiet bunch of soldiers when I joined them. Earlier, while moving forward with the attacking infantry, shells exploded all around them, splinters first hitting the lieutenant, and a little later, the sergeant. But now, they explained, the situation was easier. Looking to the right and left, I could see thousands of our infantry moving forward over the fields, walking at a steady pace. The rumbling of our motor, plus the cotton in my ears, transformed the noise of battle into one confused roar. I could not tell where the noise was coming from, but I clearly could see what was going on. Puffs of exploding shrapnel and geysers of earth from exploding shells of all calibers amidst our advancing lines seemed to be everywhere. Men were going down. Whether to take cover or because they were hit, I could not tell. We were fighting over a pretty landscape of slightly rolling hills dotted with houses and clumps of trees. Just how heavy the enemy infantry fire was, I could not determine either, but I was convinced our infantry was having a hell of a time. We rolled along but did not contribute much to the battle. Royal Flying Corps planes seemed to be everywhere and tried to stop the advance. Most of the time they were too low for us, zooming down with machine guns going full blast, and never high enough to become safe targets. We could not fire on a plane operating over the heads of our own men. The chances of hitting such fast-moving targets were practically nil, while the danger of hitting our soldiers and showering them with splinters was great. Ordinarily, good anti-aircraft fire forced the enemy to fly high, but this was a life-or-death struggle, and these RFC flyers continued to dive in regardless of the risk. Only a direct hit could stop them. We advanced slowly until sundown, when we found a cluster of trees where we could spend the night. All of us were very tired, and I thought the safest place to sleep would be under the vehicle. The truck bed and wheels would protect us fairly well from stray shots. Nearby, I saw some 10 or 15 dead English soldiers. German soldiers had ransacked their pockets. Letters and playing cards were strewn all over the place. I read many of these letters, all written by seemingly simple British people, complaining of wartime restrictions and ordinary family affairs, but all asking when they could expect the soldier home. I took some of these letters with me. Perhaps I could write the families when all this was over, but none had a return address. For the next 2 days it was more of the same. We were near Péronne on the Somme River, and I felt enemy resistance was becoming heavier, especially their artillery fire. Shells exploded too close for comfort, and we had to duck or jump in the ditch quite often, though we managed to get through safely. On March 24th, we got into another incredible traffic jam. I had no idea what had caused it, but our K-flak was jammed in tight between horse-drawn field artillery. This time British planes came roaring in, 4 or 5 at a time, strafing without mercy. None of our fighters were in sight. We had to open up and fire as best we could right over the heads of men and horses only a few feet away. Nearby infantry let go with machine guns. With few interruptions, these fights and attacks continued all day long. To the left of us was the usual procession of the Red Cross vehicles. While we worried about the danger of these constant attacks from the air, I wondered how a wounded man must have felt, completely helpless in those wagons, while machine gun bullets spattered all around. During a halt in the afternoon, we located what looked like a fine British truck about 20 yards away on a side road. It was covered and looked like something we would love to have. Curiously enough, the motor was still running. There was a little blood on the seat, but our chauffeur pronounced it a wonderful find. Inside were cans of gas, a small field bed, some tea, bread and biscuits. It looked too good to be true, and we were determined to annex it. At night we could sleep in it, out of the weather. We had to act fast. The chauffeur would drive the truck and squeeze it into the traffic behind our gun, which I would drive. But I was a very poor driver by standards of today, and when the traffic moved again, I felt uneasy. I was not sure what the dials on the instrument panel meant, and I did not know if I could stop properly and quickly. Shifting the heavy gears was no easy matter for a beginner in a constant traffic jam. For a while things went well, until I found myself driving just behind a horse-drawn infantry kitchen. It consisted of an iron kettle with a fire grate underneath, surrounded by a narrow platform on which the cook stood. I knew I was too close, but I could not help it. When the next stop came, I could not find the brakes fast enough. The cook jumped off his platform, and I ran smack into the steaming kettle, hard enough to make a disagreeable grinding noise and smash the wooden platform, bending the kettle slightly. A company commander soon appeared and shouted for quite a while. I could understand none of it while the motor was roaring. I made signs of apology, and only then did he notice I was an officer of the same rank. Perhaps he remembered it was not customary for one lieutenant to bawl out another one. At any rate, there was no time for long arguments, and this crisis also passed by. Moving along slowly on the main highway a little later, there appeared to the right of us a huge complex of large circus-like tents. I felt certain it was some sort of British supply depot, possibly supplying the whole British Fifth Army. I motioned to the chauffeur driving the truck behind us, pointing to the tents. He understood immediately. I told one of the crew to jump on the truck and help load anything we could use or eat. The column moved forward very slowly, but after some 30 minutes we had passed the depot, and I worried how the truck could ever catch up with us. About an hour later we came to a country crossroad, and to my surprise, there was the truck waiting for us, the chauffeur grinning all over his face. The soldier jumped back on the gun and told us they had loaded many cases of the most wonderful things to eat: condensed milk, tea, cocoa, corned beef, sugar, bacon, tinned butter, cookies, biscuits, and countless cartons of English Woodbine cigarettes. To convince us of his tale, he had stuffed his pockets with cigarettes and cookies. They also brought an armful of raincoats made out of real rubber, something very scarce in Germany. Our mouths watered, and we were most anxious for night to fall so we could stuff ourselves with these incredible goodies. It was a treasure beyond price. We were always hungry and completely sick of army slop. That evening some of the soldiers drank the first cup of real cocoa they had tasted in years. I loaded up on biscuits and jam, plus tea and milk, and then stretched out on the English field bed. We hardly had made a dent in our supplies when we began to worry that some staff officer might order the truck off the road as unnecessary baggage. But all in all, it had been a good day, and we were looking forward to an elegant breakfast with coffee and bacon. My men began stirring when it was still pitch dark. They were hungry and could not wait. Before we moved on, we tried to hide the food under the gasoline cans. Somebody might look in and confiscate our treasures. The forward drive continued, though very slowly. We were still on the main highway, but soon I felt that we had to get off this road or be blown to bits. I knew our captain well enough to know his orders to proceed on the main road need not be followed if circumstances made it impossible. Much later on, I read that on the 5th day of this battle, the British Fifth Army had received heavy artillery reinforcements from the French. Judging from the blasts now hitting us, I thought their artillery must be massed wheel to wheel. And the types of shells coming over had changed too. It was possible to hear a 75 mm or a 10 centimeters. Shell coming, but the heavy caliber shells came over with enormous speed, without warning, and exploded with a shattering noise in a blinding blaze of light. We could not move forward while tons of steel splinters were zooming all around us. We stopped and jumped in a narrow ditch, which felt like a haven of safety. There was no escape from such a barrage. We could survive only if we managed to drive quickly somewhere else, presently not under fire. As I looked out of the ditch, I saw that the artillery and infantry had left the highway and were scattered over the neighbouring fields to escape the shelling. The highway now seemed more or less free. We jumped on the gun and dashed off with our precious truck behind us. I never had driven the gun at top speed, but all I could do was put my foot down and let her go. Nobody was hit, and that astonished me, but I could not find a side road. After driving forward for a few minutes, we caught up with a regiment of infantry marching along without being molested by artillery. Looking behind, we still could see geysers of dirt shooting up as high as trees. So far, we had advanced about 10 miles, and the town of Albert was in front of us, some 5 miles away. Our territorial gains already exceeded those made by the massive French and British attacks mounted during the previous 2 years. But to me, our slow and very bloody progress did not look like a breakthrough, nor could I detect the slightest sign of a British collapse. Judging from the many dead and the never-ending stream of wounded coming back, it was evident the enemy had no idea of quitting. The British and French were throwing in all their reserves regardless of losses, knowing that fresh American divisions were now ready to relieve the French near Metz, so French troops could be moved north to stop our drive. That the enemy became stronger every day could be felt clearly. On March 26th, a heavy battery near us began bombarding Albert from 12 kilometers away. The latest army paper reported that a newly constructed heavy gun, the Big Bertha, was shelling Paris from a distance of 75 miles. Although nobody got hurt on the 26th, and that was a miracle, it was a trying day. Early in the morning, a motorcycle rider brought an order to abandon the truck. It was needed for more important duties. I knew we could not keep it long, so it was important to load all of our treasures onto the gun truck, and that was not easy. Our pockets were stuffed, and the rest of the biscuits and tin cans rolled around on the floor. It now seemed our forward drive had stopped completely. All we could do was to move sideways within our sector. The battle had become a slugging match. Shells of all calibers slammed into the landscape without let-up. Every half hour or so we darted off to take a new position somewhere near, always hoping it might be better there. Air targets were plentiful, and we fired whenever we could, though it did not seem to make much difference. Enemy planes were surrounded quickly by hundreds of black explosion puffs coming from all directions. According to rumours, we had massed 1,000 anti-aircraft guns for this drive. We saw a few planes shot down, but not many. Victims of air fights were much more numerous. Both sides had observation balloons up in full force. The whole front was lined with them. On our side, each balloon was protected by several small-bore cannon, able to throw up a stream of oversized machine gun bullets. In spite of this protection, burning balloons were a common sight. Looking up, one would not have to wait long to see a German or British balloon come down. It only took one hit of a tracer bullet to cause an explosion. In this battle, we laboured under considerable stress and strain, but my relations with the crew remained excellent. It may have taken longer to become an officer in the German army, but once the rank had been obtained, there was no need to assert authority because it never was challenged. The soldiers felt their officers must know more than they, or they would not be officers. Of course, there were exceptions among officers of the reserve in the rear echelons. Many had been made officers 25 years before the war. The small, so-called military courtesies always were observed under all conditions. Nobody would address me except in the third person. Personally, I would not have cared how they addressed me, but any deviation from accepted form and discipline would have shocked me, signifying a very serious breakdown. Late the afternoon of the 26th, another motorcycle messenger brought orders for me to appear at K-Flak headquarters, together with officers from batteries belonging to the same group. After sundown, a small car picked me up. The purpose of the meeting was to allocate territories for the K-Flak to operate in. I received orders to remain in my sector and then to proceed to Albert by sunrise to protect our lines against interference from the air. Albert had been taken, it was said, 81 late on the 26th. I probably would find our lines several kilometres outside of town. The same car took me back, and before I went to sleep next to the driver, I remembered our cosy English truck was no more, and I would have to sleep in the open again. When I woke up, our car had stopped on a dark road with the lights out. The driver was lost, and I had no idea where we were. Flares and gunfire were all around us, and we could not tell where our lines should be. What astonished us was the absence of soldiers. Nobody could be seen, and that was not normal at all. We had to be in no man's land. It was dark, but we could see the trees and some distance down the road. After anxious waiting, we heard voices mixed with a few loud commands coming from a road nearby. We could not tell whether they spoke German or English, so we stood still, hoping something would happen to help us. Fortunately, neither side wished to waste ammunition on this no-man's-land road. However, it was certain we had to get away before sunrise. Finally, we made up our minds and decided to turn to the left, going very slowly with lights out. After crawling along for some 15 minutes, the driver suddenly recognized a landmark. From then on, things went smoothly, and when I stretched out under the gun truck about midnight, I was too tired to worry about anything. Street fighting in Albert March 27th was a typical March day, cold and foggy. We broke camp before sunup and arrived in front of Albert about 6 a.m. According to my dictionary, the town of Albert had some 7,500 inhabitants and looked similar to other French country towns. My orders here were to concentrate on low-flying British battle flyers, who already had inflicted serious losses on our advancing troops. The Richthofen fighter group was operating over Albert, and we could see his men doing their best all day, but it looked as if nobody had the upper hand. Air fights never ceased. The sky over Albert was the stage for the most determined air battles I ever saw. Nobody gave an inch. Only lack of sufficient machine gun bullets could induce a fighter to break away. Both sides were willing to fight it out right then and there, win or lose. I could not tell how many planes were lost on both sides. It did not make much difference anyway, as fresh fighter planes would take the places of ones lost. This battle came to an end only because the sun went down for the day. While these fights went on at high altitudes, low-flying planes on each side worked on the opposing infantry and artillery without being disturbed from above. These battle planes flew so low I often thought they would crash, when suddenly they reappeared skimming the treetops. I knew they were lightly armoured underneath, but I still could not understand how so many managed to survive. Those fights were really wild. Shortly after entering Albert, we sensed that something was wrong and we became apprehensive. If the town already had been taken, where were the soldiers? The streets were empty and houses were closed. They showed very little damage. It looked as if we were the only ones in town. I expected to find the streets filled with marching troops and vehicles of all descriptions. Perhaps we were in no man's land, or perhaps the British had withdrawn without fighting, laying a huge trap for our troops to come in, only to be encircled for the final kill. What handicapped me was the fact my hearing seemed impaired. Except for very loud bangs close to me, I did not hear well enough to draw conclusions. Was the battle noise near us? I could not understand the situation, but decided to go on slowly. Turning a corner, we saw soldiers in position lying on the pavement across the street some 50 yards or so in front of us. We stopped and I went toward them to gather information, but as I approached, I saw they were dead. We had to move them to a sidewalk before we could proceed. Now I was sure we had not yet reached our line. A little further down the street, we encountered a wounded German Marine propped against a house. He was shot through the foot and told us the British were just around that corner. When I looked, I could not see the enemy and decided to go on. The noise of our motor was most annoying, and I wished I could hear something. A few minutes later, a German soldier came out of one of the houses lining the street and frantically waved us back. He seemed most anxious for us to understand that we were in grave danger unless we moved back immediately. It all seemed very queer, so, leaving our gun behind, I walked toward him. He motioned to walk close to the houses and not in the middle of the sidewalk. He also shouted, explaining that British soldiers still were holding houses at the end of the street. I thought this situation was very dangerous, but I could not understand why nobody was fighting. Across this narrow street seemed to be a headquarters. An officer appeared waving for me to come over, which I did, running fast and keeping my head low. I still did not quite understand the overall situation and was glad to meet somebody who could explain it. The captain introduced himself as the commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Infantry Regiment. Its men were known in the army as top-notch soldiers. What astonished me so was the enthusiasm with which this captain received me. He pumped my hand and thanked me profusely for coming to his aid. This introduction took place while both of us were crouching on the floor of the little house. The windows were broken, and he urged me not to stick my head above the windowsills because the British were still in the garden. This man was a professional, very polite and soft-spoken, and I knew he would not exaggerate. He offered me some wine and then began explaining. They had been in this battle since the 21st, and hoped to be relieved soon because they had reached the end of their strength. Albert had been taken the day before without too much trouble, but now, at this edge of town, they had encountered fierce resistance which had to be overcome before the battalion could break out into the open fields as ordered. The 3rd Battalion had attacked the day before, March 26th, without success and suffered terrible losses. Many of the companies now were commanded by non-coms. Most of its casualties were caused by a machine gun nest installed in a factory building about 400 yards in front of our line. That this captain and the men milling around in his headquarters were utterly exhausted could be seen easily, but they had orders to attack again at 8 a.m. The captain could see only complete failure and very bloody losses ahead of him, as long as that machine gun nest dominated the sector. The windows of the nest were well protected by sandbags, and machine guns had been placed in all 6 windows, easily visible through binoculars. Artillery was needed to knock them out, but supporting artillery was nowhere in sight. Now, quite unexpectedly, we had arrived on the scene with a field artillery gun. When I asked the captain why enemy artillery was not in action, he explained they did not dare shoot as long as the lines were so close together. The captain asked one of his aides to take me to the roof of the house so I could see the layout clearly. While going up, I wanted to say something, but my guide put his finger to his lips, asking me to be very quiet. The steep roof had a small window flush with it, which had to be raised by pushing it up. This we did slowly, trying to make no noise. When I looked out, I was flabbergasted to see the flat tin hats of British infantry below us in the garden only 50 yards away. The enemy seemed to be everywhere, some in foxholes, some in short trenches, some hidden behind trees, hedges, and so on. What I saw was not a fixed line. We could not tell exactly where their line began or where it stopped, but we were certain an attack would be a desperate undertaking. Coming down from the roof, I tried to explain our limitations. We were an anti-aircraft gun operating under orders of the air service, I told the captain, and ill-equipped for ground fighting. We did not have a protective shield like the field artillery. I realized I could not ignore the wishes of this battalion, quite apart from the fact the captain could order me to do anything he wanted. This was a desperate combat situation, and I would have to obey. Something had to be done before 8 a.m. when the new attack would have to start. Before going on with my story, I want to describe the general atmosphere prevailing on the 27th. We had learned that morning that the British soldiers opposing us in Albert had been replaced overnight by a fresh Australian division, while replacements for our side did not show up. Our supporting artillery could not get through the traffic jam. Our right flank touched the left flank of the 248th Infantry Regiment. The infantry was dead tired. We felt somewhat better because every night so far we had managed to get some sleep, although the nights were now cold. But the fighting became more ferocious by the hour, as shown by these excerpts from diaries of officers and men who survived this battle, published in book form after the war. The following happened to a battalion of the 248th Regiment, which was to the right of us and well supported by field artillery. At about 5:30 p.m., a plane drops a message saying that tanks are coming over the hill to our left. The field artillery resting 500 yards behind us is now coming forward, taking firing positions for our protection. It is their plan to let the tanks advance as near as possible. The battery opens fire on the first tank crawling over the hill, which keeps coming, firing with its cannon and machine gun. At 750 yards it gets hit and seems to explode. The crew jumps out, runs a few yards, then collapses. The other tanks move on until hit, but 3 tanks remain untouched and now are trying to encircle the remaining 2 guns. The crews of the other 2 guns have been killed or wounded during the last 10 minutes. At this moment the lieutenant commanding is hit and goes down. Of the 3 tanks, 2 more are hit but are able to leave the field under their own power. Now only 1 tank is boring in and only 1 gun is left to oppose it. On this gun all are dead or wounded, except 2 gunners. They pretend to be dead. The tank moves on to crush the gun, but when within 30 yards these 2 men jump up, hitting the tank with the last shell they had left. On the same afternoon, a member of the 248th Regiment's 2nd Battalion reported in his diary about the death of an artillery officer. His battery still was stalled somewhere in the rear, but he had gone forward to look over the situation. The attack of our battalion surprised the enemy, and we were able to take 5 officers and 129 men as prisoners. They surrendered their weapons, but a moment after throwing down their guns, they grabbed them again, and a murderous man-to-man fight started. After we had killed their commanding officer, they gave up, but during the melee the artillery officer fell mortally wounded. The above events were typical of the battle in and around Albert. Both sides were desperate for victory. Human lives were cheap, nobody gave it a thought. While talking to the Marine captain about the plans to eliminate the enemy machine gun nest, a soldier brought a message stating that a Canadian officer had been taken prisoner by the neighbouring battalion. During his interrogation, he had expressed with complete confidence his conviction that our next attack would fail. He had talked of hundreds of machine gun nests which had been constructed last night. The captain believed him, but thought these fortifications probably were a little further back where the terrain was more favourable for defence. During the last hour before the ordered attack, I was anxious to get all the information I could and at the same time explain the maximum help we could render. According to the book, the best way to knock out the nest was by indirect fire, shooting from some place not visible to the enemy. That was impossible. To do so, the gun would have to be pulled back, perhaps to the marketplace in the middle of the town, hidden under some trees if possible. Then I would have had to go forward to where I could see the target and direct the firing by telephone. But we had no telephone or telephone wire with us. The skies were full of enemy flyers, and this was not the time for a leisurely turkey shoot. After the first few shots, we would get plenty of bombs from above, and the final result would have been much in doubt. This approach also would take too long, even if we could find a field telephone somewhere. That house could be eliminated only by direct fire, and when I explained this to the captain, he wanted me to do it right away. The sooner those machine guns were out of the way, the better, he said. I became embarrassed because I had to explain again that we could not possibly succeed that way. Our number 1 gunner had to see the target clearly, and he could see it only if we left the protection of the house we were hiding behind. The minute our gun barrel was visible to the Australian riflemen some only 50 yards away, they would fill us full of lead before we could fire our first shot. I was greatly relieved when he agreed with me. I told him the best way to help would be for us to roll forward with his attack, shooting as we went, hoping to hit the nest before it could do too much damage. The captain did not like this plan very much, fearing we would be too big and slow a target. In his opinion, we would be exposed to very heavy rifle fire, especially if we failed to knock down the house with the machine guns quickly. I knew very little about this sort of fighting, and I was anxious to benefit from this man's experience. It seemed that losses always became intolerable as soon as an attack stopped. Rifle fire, mortars and field artillery then would zero in, and once they had the range, men would go down in droves. According to the captain, the only thing to do was to get up and advance. The enemy would shoot well and calmly from a comfortable distance, he said, but losses would diminish the faster we attacked. During the last 100 yards, the enemy would fire too high. He had no time to adjust his sights. That sounded plausible, and finally we agreed on a hit-and-run attack. All this talk was nice enough, but the whole thing was rather terrifying. I did not want to speculate on our chances for survival. I was apprehensive, and my pulse probably was not normal, though I felt I could manage all right. I wished to be somewhere else, but I discarded those thoughts as completely useless. If speed was a life-saving factor, then we would manage well because speed was our forte. I thought it best not to explain the plan in detail to the whole crew. The driver, however, had to play a major role. From the roof, I let him see the road we had to travel. The house we wanted to demolish could be seen clearly, some 400 yards away and about 20 yards to the left of the road. Halfway was a country crossroad. We had to advance to there, but not farther, because we needed the crossroad to turn around. Arriving at the crossroad, we would have to fire point blank and hit the house quickly. We could not survive a drawn-out fight with several machine guns and all those Australian riflemen. We had to operate fast, I emphasized. The driver understood perfectly and assured me he would get us in and out without fail. Of course, we both understood that we would advance at full speed as soon as the Marines started their attack, and at the rate of 25 miles per hour, we would be way in the rear of the Australians within minutes. According to the captain, the enemy would be too rattled to turn around and attack us. His men would take care of that, he assured me. It was now about half an hour before 0 hour. The crew knew we would join in the coming attack and would try to knock out machine guns. They were ordered to set 12 shells at point-blank range. Each man of the loading crew was to have 1 shell under his arm ready to load with the utmost speed. The number 1 gunner was the one operating the sights. Our number 1 was a quiet, dependable boy who never talked much. He did his duty like an expert. I often thought that his speed in getting a target into the sights was astonishing. It was his duty to get the house squarely into his sights before he shouted, "Ready!" and he understood the importance of it. He knew we could not afford to miss at a range of 200 yards. I now believed our surprise attack would succeed, but I could not figure out how we would manage to get back. After raising hell on that battlefield with the only gun on our side, we would be a target as big as a barn door. About 15 minutes before 0 hour, our heavy artillery started a bombardment. It seemed to fall all along the line. Perhaps the whole Second Army would attack now. The big shells coming from somewhere behind us made a constant humming noise. Some seemed to shriek as if they were tumbling over in the air. Salvo after salvo exploded on the other side. The geysers of mud and debris could be seen easily, but we were disappointed because none of the shells landed among the enemy directly in front of us. Our artillery tried to seal off the battlefield so reinforcements could not come through. On the hour, the Marines started the attack, and that was our cue. I had forgotten to ask the captain about enemy mines, and that bothered me, but off we went. Out of the corner of my eye I could see Marines coming out of houses, foxholes and trenches in great numbers. I vaguely wondered where they all came from. The crossroad was reached very quickly and the gun was loaded. Shortly before the takeoff, I had told the number 2 gunner, who pulled the trigger, to be careful and not shoot before the chauffeur and I had jumped off the front seats. I had tried to make a little joke about what would happen if he shot our heads off, but I guess I was not funny. Nobody felt like laughing. My feet barely had touched the ground when our first shell came screaming out of the barrel. The flash and crack almost flattened me. The crew reloaded, fired, reloaded, fired, reloaded, and fired again with amazing speed. Nobody had time to watch the target except me. Glancing back, I saw the number 1 gunner had been hit and fall from his seat, bleeding. But the gun sights were set, and new shells were jammed into the barrel before the recoils ended. By this time I already had seen that the very first shell had slammed right into the nest, as did every one of the following shots. Men could be seen jumping out of the windows. The house seemed to explode and started to burn. The target existed no more. It had been quite easy. The loss of these machine guns must have been a blow to the Australians. Perhaps they did not know what to make of us, or they did not realize we had a field gun aboard. But they knew now. The first shot of ours had made me almost deaf. As the small arms fire reached a crescendo, I could not make out whether they were shooting at us, except that a rifle bullet had knocked off one of our gunners. Waving my arm to follow me, the crew jumped into a ditch, half carrying the wounded man with them. He still could move a little under his own power. My only thought was to get out of there. To do it quickly was imperative. I could not see how the fight was going. Did our men catch up with us, or were we still behind the Australian front lines? If so, one hand grenade would have finished us off. One man had dressed the gunner's wound, and it did not appear that he was badly hurt, although I could not be sure. I was anxious to get him to a dressing station. What bothered us the most now was the fact the gun was pointed in the wrong direction. It had to be turned around. To go back and reach the safety of the first house 200 yards away in reverse gear would not be possible because the truck was too slow. We would never make it and stay alive. I was convinced our luck could not last much longer. We were in a tight spot. Tiny bits of flying earth and rock told us the rifle fire still was heavy, making it risky to try returning on foot. I had no clear idea where the enemy was, and I did not know what to do next. At that instant, Rupp the chauffeur shouted something into my ear which I could not understand. The next moment he cranked up the motor, jumped on and turned the truck around while the rest of us held our breath. As he came alongside our ditch, we jumped on too. I never have understood why nobody got hurt on that wild ride. One machine gun burst could have killed the driver who had to sit upright on his seat. The roar of battle made it quite impossible for us to hear whether bullets were zooming around us or not. When we reached the safety of the first house, we stopped and tried to relax. Our gunner's wound did not seem too bad. It looked as if the bullet had gone through his upper leg. Everybody seemed to be in high humour to have escaped alive. I thanked the chauffeur for what I thought was a magnificent performance. He received the Iron Cross First Class, the highest decoration a soldier below the rank of lieutenant could obtain. I never had met such a character. He was about 35 years old, much older than the rest of the crew. Whenever quick and resolute action was required, he was there to do it, and his loud laugh could be heard at all times. Besides being a former racing driver, he was a top-notch mechanic and did all the repair work on the gun and motor. His conversation was exclusively about racing, motors, women and more women. While regaling those 20-year-old boys with his wild tales, they wondered if so much could be true. But they admired him all the same. I was lucky to have had him on the crew. Of the many people I met during 4 years of war, he was one of the few I can remember well. Tall, very strong-looking, his face broad and red all over. Not brown, but red. When I asked him what had made him jump on the truck under those very dangerous circumstances, probably saving our lives, his answer was, "The motor is in fine shape and I'm not letting those SOBs shoot it up." Bagging a Bristol. It was now about 9:30 a.m. Before resuming our routine duty of shooting at low-flying planes, we had a good meal of corned beef and all the other delicacies still on hand from our raid on the British supply depot a few days before. Albert still looked empty with the exception of dressing stations established in cellars. We soon found ourselves in the marketplace. I was looking for some open space from where we could operate without being hemmed in by houses, but shells came over too often for comfort. A British shell had hit the Golden Madonna on Albert's medieval church. When we saw it, she was hanging head down from a wire, as if plunging to her death. It became a famous picture, published in many newspapers. Cruising around Albert, the first talked to a Marine officer who said the attack of his division had petered out. Some ground had been taken, but unless heavy reinforcements arrived quickly, he feared the Marines would be pounded to pieces. So the Canadian officer predicting failure had been right. In one of the town's side streets we saw a small but elegant-looking shoe store. For several years Albert had been occupied by British troops, and the high boots I saw in that store window looked very good to me. Our shoes were always in bad shape because it was so difficult to obtain new ones. We barely had entered when the ceiling seemed to collapse. Plaster and dust fell on us, and we decided a small bomb or a shell had hit next door. I saw no point in staying there any longer. A few men grabbed some shoes while I took a very elegant cane that was leaning against a counter. For some time it was my prized possession, but I lost it. I thought it best to leave town and find an open field. But before we could do that, British battle flyers jumped us at exactly 10:10 a.m., according to my official report. First, I saw explosions in front of us while we drove along one of the side streets, and I wondered where they came from. I did not believe at all that they were aimed at us. Then the man behind me touched my shoulder, drawing my attention to an explosion behind us. The dust was still settling. Looking up, several Bristol double-deckers carrying 2 men and 2 machine guns could be seen milling around over our heads, looking enormously big as they flew no more than 100 feet above us. I still was not certain whether they were after us or some other target. We stopped and I ordered the crew to take cover beneath the gun. We survived the next explosion, but it was awfully close. Perhaps it would have been better to run when we first saw these planes. But now we were in a tight spot again. One bomb hit would cause our ammo to explode. Given enough time, they would finish us off for sure. There were 4 planes or more. Their speed must have been about 100 miles per hour, and that was much too fast for aimed fire at so low a target. After blowing "Man the gun," on my whistle, the crew jumped on the truck under orders to set shrapnel at point-blank range, maximum elevation straight up, load and wait for my signal for rapid fire. I was glad to have such a fine crew. They understood perfectly. When I saw the wings of the Bristols coming over the rooftops to my left, we blasted away so fast I thought the whole gun might topple over. Within seconds, I saw one plane hit, coming down squarely as if it would fall on top of us. This episode took less time than it takes to write about it. We were sure they would come back. I had to give no orders. The crew had reloaded and waited for my signal. Again, they came over the rooftops. Fortunately, at the very last split second, I recognized that these planes were triple-deckers belonging to the Richthofen squadron. I was thankful the crew was disciplined enough not to have started firing before I could give the signal. To shoot down Richthofen, the national hero, would have been awful. However, he was not personally among these flyers who saved us. Within minutes, the sky was clear. We were safe, but although we had shot down a plane, there was no elation. Asterisk. We were getting mighty tired and wondered if this sort of thing would go on all day long. I was looking for a place where we could spend the rest of the day in a less hectic manner without being accused of running away. Asterisk. The RFC suffered a fairly high number of casualties on March 27, 1918, creating difficulties in determining the identity of the Bristol and its crew, brought down by K Flak 82. This plane probably was a Bristol F-2B fighter, although Nagel refers to it as a Bristol double-decker. On this date, 10 two-seaters were reported lost by the RFC, while the Germans claimed 17 British two-seaters as shot down or forced to land. Of these, German pilots claimed a total of 7 Bristol fighters, and Flak Units 3, including Na driver, had the same idea. Repairs on the motor had to be made before we could go out again, he said. The desire was overwhelming to sleep in that comfortable bed back in our old quarters where we started 6 days before. Since this offensive began, the enemy had been pushed back 12 to 15 miles in our sector, and no shells could reach us. Everybody washed up, and once more I felt like a human being. Before going to bed, I sent the following report to Captain Specht, the group commander of K Flak No. 2. Action of March 27, 1918. I took a firing position at the east exit of Albert. Because the infantry was fighting without artillery support, I thought it best to support them, although enemy flyers were very active. After consulting with the battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Infantry Regiment, I proceeded to the exit on the highway Albert-Millencourt, where we attacked a machine gun nest that was especially harmful to our infantry. The house went up in flames after the 4th shot. We fired on the fleeing crews. As agreed upon with the leader of the attacking battalion, we advanced on a side road. We succeeded in routing the enemy. At 10:10, we were suddenly attacked by infantry flyers. We shot one down with the 8th shot. Losses: 1 man wounded. K. Flack, 82. Nagel Lieutenant. The next day, March 28th, again was rainy and cold, and we made the best out of this period of rest. We knew that all divisions fighting since March 21st had been replaced and withdrawn for rest, but nobody seemed to think about withdrawing us for a little while. Air battles increased in ferocity, and all K. Flaks were needed. Richthoven's Red Plane could be seen every day in our sector. My diary reminded me of a story making the rounds at that time. Baron Albrecht von Richthoven, the flyer's father, was a retired major and too old for service. Just about this time, when the big air fights gels, the RFC-RAF War Diary shows the loss of only 2 Bristol fighters that day, one from 20 Squadron and another from 11 Squadron. It is known that Manfred von Richthoven shot down the Bristol from 20 Squadron, but he also received credit for another Bristol F-2B fighter on the same day. According to Royal Flying Corps Communiqué No. 133, considerable activity in the air occurred over Albert on March 27th and involved both low-level bombing missions and offensive fighter patrols. Of the latter, several were flown by members of Bristol-equipped 22 Squadron RFC, although this unit did not record any losses that day. As to the bombing raids mentioned in the War Diary for March 27th, only 18 Squadron flying DH-4S lost an aircraft in the Albert area. Were a daily occurrence, he decided to visit his son. Permission was granted. When he arrived at the airstrip of his son's squadron, none of the flyers whose names he knew greeted him. They were up in the air fighting over their own airfield against a swarm of Royal Flying Corps fighters. Before he could pick up his bag, 2 of our fighters came sailing down, crashing right in front of him. That was too much for the old man. He wanted to be taken home right away. It was the last time he saw his son Manfred, who was shot down and killed a short time later. Curiously enough, I always thought I had witnessed his last battle, but checking on the dates, this was not so. I was in school in Lille. For the first time since March 20th, I saw the group commander. He was extremely friendly and praised us. All this I could not quite understand, until he read to me a report received through channels from the 1st Marine Infantry Regiment, dated Albert, March 27th, 9 a.m. The Lieutenant Nagel of K. Flak 82 today advanced with his autoflak to within about 200 yards of the first enemy line without seeking shelter, supporting the heavy fighting infantry by firing directly at enemy machine gun nests. He fought most successfully against low-flying enemy planes. The commander and crew of the flak are fully deserving to be decorated because their performance must be described as quite outstanding. Signed, Engholm, Captain Commander 3rd Bat. Marine Inf. Regiment No. 1. After the war, I was anxious to know whether this nice Marine captain had survived. Going over a list of 2,145 names listed as killed in action with the 1st Marine Regiment, I was glad when I did not find his name. Of course, all this noise about us pleased me very much, and I hoped my decoration would come through. The next few days were routine, but hard on our nerves. Albert was crumbling under heavy bombardment, so we tried to find some reasonably safe position near the town in one of the fields. It was cold, rainy, and wet. A fine drizzle never stopped, and the idea of remaining out there all day made us shiver. Most of the time we spent in little slit trenches hastily dug, but good enough for protection. None of the heavy shells came too close. Knowing that my stay in this sector would be over very soon, I had no wish whatever playing the hero. My last day here got us into contact with a very furious major. It was foggy and impossible to see more than 20 yards or so. At one time I had no idea where we were. I especially was afraid of gas shells, which were impossible to see or hear exploding in foggy weather. As we stood there, everything was peaceful. No artillery or small arms fire could be heard anywhere. Then, out of the fog, came a major, all wrapped up in a shawl. He stalked toward us through the mud, swinging his walking cane in the air as one would when approaching a trespasser. He began shouting, but we had too much cotton in our ears to understand him. He still was shouting when within a yard of me, telling me to go away and to do so quickly. What could we do with that silly little gun? He asked. His men had suffered enough, he said, and when the fog lifted, the enemy would zero in on us. but would hit his men in that trench, etc., etc. He threatened that his men would take pot shots at us if we did not disappear right away. They would be furious, he emphasized. I tried to reason with him a little because in the fog I did not know where to go. But that man was hysterical. We left. We still were operating in territory very recently evacuated by the enemy. His dugouts, equipment and shot-up wagons could be seen everywhere. Discarded rubber raincoats were in profusion. Looking around with my binoculars, I saw a tidy-looking dugout with the door open some 50 yards away from us. It would offer excellent dry shelter, so I went over to take a look. I had entered many of these enemy dugouts and was always impressed by the fact they were so poorly constructed compared to ours. It was as if the builders did not care, but this one looked good. It had a very small window in the rear, although the light was so dim I hardly could see. I was shocked when I saw 2 English officers at a table, one sleeping with his head on his arm and the other sitting straight up. Both had their caps on. This sudden confrontation stupefied me. I stood there wondering if they would say hello when I realized they were dead. To see these men in that dim light, motionless and so rigid, made my heart pound. I left quickly. Once outside, I began to understand that something was wrong. Our infantry had not entered to look for food or good English shoes, because the bodies were booby-trapped. How could a dead man sit upright on a chair? I clearly remember the gruesome atmosphere of that episode. When I told my driver about it, he, of course, was eager to go in there and get their shoes. He knew all about booby traps, he said. Nothing doing, I told him. One other thing also became clear. Germany was slowly but surely being starved. There was not enough substantial food to be had. The very small amounts of meat available for soldiers were just enough to whet their appetites for more. I constantly daydreamed about eating double portions of Wiener Schnitzel with fried eggs on top, and loads of fried potatoes, all in one of those small but cosy restaurants with wood panelling and red and white checkered tablecloths. I wondered if such wonderful times would ever come back. However, we had plenty of fatless vegetables, potato soup and black bread mixed with wood shavings, according to rumours. Our uniforms and shoes were in bad shape too. I had a cap made out of some sort of grass fibre. We never could win this war against such superiority, and I did not care much either. There was nothing I could do about it. Our newspapers were full of gibberish about resisting to the last man, unless the Allies could make decent peace proposals. But by then it was very clear that our enemies could and would crush us. Through history, the German soldier has been known for his good fighting qualities. I do not know why. In peacetime, however, no people are more industrious or more peaceful. Fistfights or attacks with knives and pistols practically were unknown among grown-ups. I never saw a fight, except among school children. Good news. On April 1st, 1918, a messenger brought me a note signed by a full general. Command of 23rd Reserve Corps Headquarters, April 1st, 1918. In the name of His Majesty the Emperor and King, I am decorating the Lieutenant of the Reserve Nagel of K Flak 82 with the Iron Cross 1. Class. Signed, Kalak X, General of Infantry. At the same time, I was told to go out for a few more days and then get ready for a transfer to a new artillery school for officers of the brand new 88mm anti-aircraft batteries. Nothing could suit me better, and I eagerly waited for my orders to come through. The men of K Flak 82 were the best soldiers I ever saw, and so easy to get along with. From now on, I knew they would have a very hard time. On August 8, 1918, the Allies broke through in this sector, attacking with swarms of tanks, infantry, and endless reserves. In his memoirs, Ludendorff called this date the Black Day. K Flak 82 was still operating in that area, so I wrote and asked for news. A Lieutenant Hauscher answered under the date of August 27, 1918. The guy still had not lost his sense of humour. He addressed his letter to me, calling me Gustav Nagel. At that time, Gustav Nagel was a famous nut who walked naked all around Germany. He made speeches declaring that everything would be fine if people abandoned all capital letters and let their beards grow. His beard reached to the floor. Noti? Hauscher wrote, "Thanks very much for your lines. Because you are still interested in us, I will write you not over 3 lines, We are in a mess, and a deep one. On the same road we advanced in spring, we are now retreating, but slowly. During the first day, when there was no field artillery here, we had to join the fight of the songs and chariot on the ground. They could not get sufficient ammo to us. Under those hardships, motor and gun broke down every few minutes. At this moment, all K flaks and 3 heavy flaks are kaput. The Tommies took away all the guns from Lieutenant Roth. Martin received the Iron Cross First Class. K Flak 82 is in bad shape. Heavy losses, 8 men, our commander killed, non-coms Hahn, Lowett and gunner Foeman wounded. Petzold sick with dysentery. But what can we do? Personally, I am fine, but wish you could help us a little. None of these names were familiar to me. The officer and men killed or wounded was bad news, coming from an outfit consisting of only 1 officer and 7 men to begin with. I wished I could find out what had happened to the crew I knew. I took my time in getting to the artillery school in Lille. In Cambrai I had nice quarters, and the next day I arrived in Lille, where the school was located in the best part of town. For a few days we did nothing but wait for the school to open officially on April 6th. Quarters were excellent. To me, these training courses were like vacations. Some 150 officers were supposed to learn enough about this new 88mm gun so they could go out and take command after the course was completed. The first evening we were fed in a large barn-like hall. I did not know anybody. Most of the men were older and seemed to be of the reserve, with the exception of the colonel and his aides, who were professionals. These army dinners were always on the formal side. Nobody sat down until the colonel did, and everybody was called by his rank with the prefix Mr. The use of first names was out of the question. The colonel introduced himself while all of us stood up. The dinner was supposed to begin, but the colonel asked for silence. He said he had received a telegram from Supreme Headquarters in Kreuznach, Germany, dated April 6th, which he now wished to read with great pleasure. Of course, everybody thought peace had broken out. We could go home. How wonderful. But after hearing the telegram's first sentence, anybody could have knocked me down with a feather. I heard my name, but I became too confused to understand the rest. During the storming of Albert, the Luti, Nagel of K Flak 82 rendered valuable services to the infantry by his resolute and successful action. Shooting down an enemy infantry flyer on the same morning added more success to the flak. To the Lieutenant Nagel and his crew of K Flak 82, I convey my full appreciation for his courageous conduct and his fine performance. The Commanding General von Huppner. After the reading, there was complete silence. The colonel spoke. If this Luti, Nagel, is present, will he please come forward to receive this telegram? He handed it to me with the remark that I was the first flak officer so honoured. There was a lot of handshaking and noise. The rest of the evening passed in a general celebration. It was very pleasant for me, and I liked it, but I felt more like a freak of some sort than anything else. Every 2 weeks, the High Command published a short army-type newspaper under the title Special Deeds. Our action in the battle for Albert received a generous amount of publicity, and in one issue we shared some of the glory with the exploits of the flyers and submarines. I had a copy but lost it.